Hi, everybody. As promised, I wanted to talk to you today a bit about the traditional role of drugs slash plants or plant medicines in traditional tantric yoga, oral tradition of the Mahasiddha yoga. So there's been a lot of discussion about this, of course, building up in the past few years because we see two really prevalent uses for different types of drugs lately. For psilocybins that come from mushrooms, basically, for mescaline compounds coming from peyote-type cactuses, for DMT coming from either synthetic or through ayahuasca, datura, all these different kind of ways, acacia trees I've heard about recently. There's been a lot of talk about these methodologies for awakening, or what we would call in our tradition in Sanskrit, Shaktipata. So we want to unpack this and try to understand it a little bit better so we know the role that it might or might not play in our own lives, but also how the tradition understands it. You have to bear with me. I'm still getting over a bit of a cough and cold. I may have to break for a tissue. So basically there's two areas that we see so much talk going on. Joe Rogan Experience, the best podcast out there, one of the best, had Ben Shapiro on recently, and they were talking about it. It was amazing. Everybody's talking about it. Of course, Joe Rogan talks about it quite a bit, and so do many others. But there's this interesting area of therapy that's being discussed now, where psilocybins, DMT, even MDMA, ecstasy, has been used for post-traumatic stress disorder, for depression, for all these different conditions, and showing great promise, which is great. A study that I think is really fantastic, I think it was done by, Harvard? No. John Hopkins, I think, was with people who were dying, and they weren't accepting that they were dying, and they were fearing death and so forth. And they, I think, did psilocybin in this experiment with these groups, and everybody had really great experiences, and they felt so much easier about going into death because they had seen into the deeper reality of the world a little bit. That's a fantastic blessing to go into death in a good way. So that's a great use of it. So there's a therapeutic use is what I'm trying to say. This is one great uses for these drugs, plant medicines, etc. at this modern time, which is finally being researched again since, 1970 in the United States, when the sweeping law was written banning most of psychotropics at that time. Of course, they didn't catch everything, but most of them. And there's always ways around it. I remember my Mormon friends who weren't allowed to take any drugs would drink Coca-Cola and take aspirin. They would drink 5 or 6 Coca-Colas, like a liter or 2 of Coca-Cola, and take like 20 or 30 aspirin. And somehow this had a magic psychotropic effect when it was combined. So try that one. Anyway, just to say, lots of things are out there, lots of ways to change your consciousness. Now, the second great usage of this thing, plant medicines or drugs, etc., is for awakening of consciousness. And we know that's gotten a lot of headlines lately. And I have to say, jokingly, that if we could just get all these world leaders who are the despotic types, no names needed, you know who I'm talking about, and they're not going to meditate, and they're not going to do even yoga nidra. They can't do anything. Basically, they need an outside agent to step in and help them, just like people who need it for therapy, to use these drugs in psychiatric therapy. So if you had world leaders having a wonderful ayahuasca ceremony trip, contextualized properly, and they saw the mother ayahuasca and got that everything is connected and everything is alive and conscious, including themselves, maybe, just maybe, things would change in the world. I got a feeling they would, rapidly. So, but anyway, that's really holding out for something that probably will never happen in my lifetime. So let's talk about this. Now, a student on retreat gave us this book. I'll put a plug in for this book, How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan. How to Change Your Mind. I love it. I think it's fantastic. Super well written. If you haven't read it yet, it's a really great read. And he's a very balanced journalist. And what I love about him is, he wasn't into psychedelics or anything like this, or meditation or anything. And he said, let me go and try this out. I have to find out what this is about if I'm going to write about it. So he tried it out and found it and wrote about it. So it's a really great book, and it discusses the spiritual and the healing and how they intersect and so on. So there's been a long history. Forget about the healing side right now. I'm all for every kind of psychotropic agent to heal people from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicide, fear of death. I'm all for it. This might explain a bit of why. In the long history of spiritual work from every tradition I know of, in Taoism, they had, I forget what they used to call it, the smoke room or something. They used to have a room that was closed off, and they would put heaps and heaps of marijuana on coals, and you sit there meditating. The room was just suffused with smoke, and you were stoned to the bejesus, and they would meditate like that. There was soma in the ancient Vedic tradition, where the whole community got together and was given a drink of basically DMT, a low-level DMT. Some people said there was THC in it as well. So the formula is not truly known. Many people say, I know the formula, but really we don't know. But it sounds like DMT with a little pot. And certainly things like mace, the covering on nutmeg, and nutmeg itself in high doses, which I've experienced very high doses of, will absolutely alter your state of consciousness, sometimes for like a week at a time. So in my training, I had the path of poisons, and I experienced a lot of this with my Indian teachers, gurus, agoris, and so on. And I also had this experience by training in ayahuasca in the Peruvian Amazon with an ayahuasquero back in the 80s. And that was very beautiful and powerful. And I trained actually to be an ayahuasquero, even though I never practiced as one. And I took my fair share of mescaline, et cetera, all these things, and mushrooms. So in ancient culture, there were two uses for these drugs or plant medicines. People have a hard time with the term drug. Drugs just means a substance which is meant to create a physiological change in your body, brain chemistry, whatever. So I don't mind calling every plant medicine drugs. I don't have to feel like I'm disconnecting from Mother Earth if I call plant medicines drugs, okay? They're all drugs. And when they come out of a factory, when DMT is produced in a factory, MDMA is produced in a factory, lysergic acid is produced in a factory, it's a synthetic drug. It's not even from a plant at that point most times. So here we go. Let's look at this. Ancient culture, the whole ancient culture, a lot of ancient cultures had certain times of the year where people would partake in mind-altering substances, contextualized in a religious framework that would give them an experience of God, the gods, or your essential nature, right? Even better, some deeper look into who you really are. But this was all dependent on, your aptitude, your desire, your karma to be a spiritual being or not, what you saw and what you experienced and so forth, as well as a bit of the contextualizing. So there was the ancient Vedic Soma ceremony, there was ayahuasca ceremony, there was taking peyote as groups, and so on and so on, like in Native American church. We know all around the world this was done. Even in Europe, they took Amanita muscaria, the mushroom, the toadstool, which you take by itself, and you're pretty much going to die a horribly painful death from kidney failure. But like the Vikings used to do, they would feed it to the dogs, and the dogs would they'd feed a lot of water to the dogs would eat the mushroom, excrete the attenuated version of the drug from the mushroom into their urine. And then the Vikings would collect the urine, they would drink the urine. It was safe then, and they could still get high. Also in Stav, the yew tree, the classic yew tree, has poisonous resins and oils in the needles and in the fruit. But if you sit underneath the yew, they're quite a massive tree, and they cast these branches, it's a pine tree, and they come down this angle like this. If you sit underneath, where all of the needles have fallen continually over the year, and it's a hot summer day, this aroma, this oil, these volatile oils are then produced, which come up. And I've trained like that in Stav too. And this is also a valid method of experiencing heavens or the gods, right? Okay, so the whole world had this kind of thing. And there were ways of using mushrooms, I think, all the way back into the Viking times in group ceremonies. You might have even seen it in the Viking TV series. So the whole world was doing this. But here's the thing. This was, I think, powerful and important for lay people because they weren't yogins. Does everybody understand clearly what I'm saying? This is super important. The average person in the community was not a yogin. They were not going to sit down and meditate deeply and do these strange yoga practices. And, society couldn't function if everybody was a yogin, pretty much. So once a year, multiple times a year, the society would get together and have a ceremony that was a sacred vision ceremony, right? And that would keep everybody understanding and orienting, this is where we're going. This is the truth of life. Everything else we do comes out of this truth of life. And it's beautiful and sacred because it comes out of this fundamental truth, which we call in our school in Trika Mahasiddha Yoga, we would call the base, right? Base, which is not a state of consciousness, not a thing, can't be known, can't be described, only via negativa, saying what it's not, right? It's not form, it's not formless, it's beyond both. Everything arises within this ultimate spaciousness, and it contains the potentiality for all energy that arises and the manifestation of that energy as everything we see in the universe and experience, including ourselves and this video right now. So this ancient way of getting people in touch with their base through community ceremony was very powerful. And I think it was important. And I'm really sad to see that that's gone in our culture. There's no other ways to connect this way. It's causing, I think, a serious death of spirituality in the world today, which is causing the problems we're having right now ecologically, with misogyny, rise of radical fundamental religions that hate women, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's the background of it. Tantric yoga, as it became organized and codified in the oral tradition, later written down, developed like 8 or 9, depending what list you read, of classic ways that Shaktipata, or awakening our experience of this base, directly experiencing the base, or at least having an observation of the base in operation, even if we don't self-identify with it and become irreversibly enlightened. There's listing 8 or 9 ways that this can happen through Tantric Mahasiddha Yoga. One of these ways we're going to discuss today is called Aushadhi in Sanskrit. At least that's how I learned it, what it's called. And Aushadhi would be that you would take some type of drug and you would have then this experience of the base. Now, how is this practiced in the yoga communities? Well, here's a few ways. Every Shivaratri, it was very classic, which is in the winter, Mahashivaratri, the great night of Shiva. Classic for people to stay awake all night meditating, or if you're devotionally oriented, chanting or doing mantras towards Shiva, to have like a total experience or a revelation, to try to get a revelation about what Shiva is, meaning your own base. But if you're into duality still in your path, you haven't gotten to non-duality yet, then you have a revelation of the god Shiva, and that's possible too, using drugs. Now, they would use THC in modern times in the form of hash balls, marijuana, cooked into milk with mantras during the full moon night of Shivaratri, during the dark moon. And they would do this at this time to make a very powerful drug, which would then influence the consciousness, influence the centers of the brain that are constantly chattering, to stop, to relax, to slow down. And for you to have a direct experience of connecting through the senses to your whole situation, to what's really here. So that idea continued in the yoga tradition and still goes on today in India. It happened in my Indian gurus' tradition. Satyananda would do this at the ashram, and everybody would get a hit of this kind of milk and get very, very stoned, basically, and do tons of kirtan. And in that heightened state, they were practicing meditation as well. Many people would experience Shaktipata. They experience a deep connection to their base, an understanding about what that is, that would then give them orientation to continue with their sadhana after that, with their spiritual practices after that. Okay, so there's that way where it was done as a community, which survived out of old community practice into the yogic community practice. There's also individual practice of the yogin following the path of poison. And following this path, called path of poison, because these are not like things you would take all day long to be a happy, healthy person. These are things you use every now and then to push your consciousness to the edge so that you can just break through. So in that path, there are many different kinds of experiences and drugs that are used. Now, the big question is this a really great way for us as spiritual practitioners to get Shaktipata of our base? In other words, the great question of for whom and when. For whom is this appropriate and when is this appropriate? And this is what we need to discuss. Okay, when we talk about using Aushadhi, it's usually talked about for people who are not as talented as yogins, who don't have or haven't had lower level Shaktipatas that are giving way to larger and higher Shaktipata experiences. This is not to be abusive to those people. This is just their level of, ability in this lifetime. In this case, it can cause a quickening for those people. Those people can have kind of a rapid acceleration of their spiritual orientation if they were to have a plant medicine give them a vision of the world, a vision of their universe, a vision of the base, even if they cannot self-identify with it. Because remember, the really salient formula is that you're introduced to the base. You're introduced to the base, usually by the teacher's teachings, you're introduced to the base, but you can have it spontaneously occur as well. And from the framing that you get from working on your consciousness with doing the foundation practices, view, training, and regular sadhana, you may be able to self-recognize yourself as that base. Maybe. And then the last step is to be able to continue in that state. And that's not a state, continue in that experience of yourself as the base. So this is a three-step practice, three-step path. Basically, everything we do is about these three steps. This is the overarching view of Trika Mahasiddhi Yoga. So accomplishing the first step of that, wow, being introduced to your base, that can happen with drugs, right? Now, what is the advantage of that? Like I said, it was kind of for the lay people always, and it's also for maybe the yogis who are kind of stuck. If any of you have read Carlos Castañeda's series of books, you'll read about an interesting experience where his teacher, Don Juan, felt that he just wasn't getting where he needed to go. He was a UCLA anthropologist, always carrying around his notebook, always in his head, and he just wasn't having a breakthrough in his spirituality, his understanding of how the universe is constructed and what his part is in that, or how he is that universe. And then he gave him some mescalate, right? And it flipped him out, but basically showed him what he needed to see, apparently, in the books anyway. This is the idea. Now, if you've been practicing earnestly for 5 or 10 years, and you really feel like, look, I've had no fundamental, powerful breakthroughs where I saw the universe as really open, beautiful, loving, me as a part of it, not even the first step of like the self-recognition we were talking about over here, recognizing yourself, and just haven't had that, then by all means, I think it's really good in the right context, to receive this kind of a plant medicine and have that experience. And I do believe that in the right context means native traditions, people who will point it out to you, or high-level yoga sadhaks. Like, let's say if I was going to lead an ayahuasca ceremony, I never did, even though I was trained in it, or a mushroom circle or something like that. And we would meditate, and we would actually go over view teachings and go through stage view training during the trip is what I would do for 6-8 hours with everybody, I think. And we would chant devotional things and really open up and get the energy moving as we move out of our thinking discursive minds into our direct experience. So if that was happening for a student of the Dharma in some traditional context, ayahuasca, Native American church, whatever it is, that could be truly profound. And I do think it's something that is useful for a person who's truly stuck, truly stuck. But the big caveat, the big warning caution is, if you're lazy, this is not a route to enlightenment. That's the key. If you're lazy, this is not the route to get enlightened. You should do the work yourself. And this brings up a big difference between Aushadhi, Shaktipada awakening through drugs, and doing it through yogic practice and receiving your own essence experience of Shaktipata. Because Shaktipata is not given to you by some teacher by hitting you on the head with peacock feathers or by staring at you with goo eyes and having you breathe in a certain way. That is Vidya Shakti. That's very different. That is an energy transmission which can have content, but it is definitely not the base. Even if a person is meditating in the base, staring at you, it doesn't mean the base is going to jump into you. All right. This is something I wish to kind of play down. It's getting very, very popular today. It develops dependencies on teachers and gurus. It develops an empowerment sense on your part. And it also develops a materialism to kind of think that the base is a thing that can be shuttled between people, which is utterly ridiculous. The base is who you are already. You already are the base. So, like I said, though, I think for the person who has been really earnest in their practice, really struggling for a long time, this could be something that gives them that beatific vision. And then you practice again, right? Because it always has to be stabilized. In all the studies I've read so far, they're talking about people that have had these visions. They've tested now about spirituality and the drug it's happening. And people will have a beatific vision, what we would call Shaktipata, somewhere between like maybe 1 to 4 on the scale of 1 to 9. And they wouldn't recognize their nature, but it was a very powerful vision, and it gave them great orientation to continue to practice and follow the path. And they would go back to them and check at later times. Now, everybody is reporting that the effect is still there, but to a lesser degree. So over time, 6 months, a little lesser. 1 year, a little less. Year and a half, a little less. It's not as fresh and palpable anymore. This is what creates the problem today with people doing this type of al-shadi, taking drugs to have awakenings over and over and over again. As yogins, this is not the way we want to do it. This isn't wise. And this wasn't really the way it was developed in the traditions it came from either. You weren't supposed to be doing peyote every Saturday for the rest of your life. You weren't supposed to be singing an ayahuasca ceremony every Saturday the rest of your life, and getting high all the time. That's just getting high. It's also being lazy, because what happens there is very dangerous. We turn the opening experience Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. If we were to have this idea that we should have these awakenings through drugs over and over and over again, we can actually become attenuated to the experience, which it becomes common for us, not so shocking anymore. Rather than we're familiar with our base and it makes us deeply spiritual, we can become more spiritually materialistic about it. Also, we can start to develop it as a kind of object where we are thinking that the state of consciousness produced by the chemical change in our brain is actually the base. And that's actually an incorrect type of perception that can happen the very first time that this occurs. You take a drug, you move into this open thing, you're kind of at the experience of the base, but because you have no Dharma training, this is a very important point. Because you have no Dharma training, no deep view training, no meditation training on what it is to let go of the mind, what it is to not form a concept around what it is you're experiencing, boom, you will form a concept. You don't see it, it's very subtle, but you will form a concept. This is the base, but it's actually a concept of the base that's coming on because of the drug experience, right? And you misidentify the base. That's a problem that a lot of people have. I mean, that is probably the number one problem I see with the drug tradition nowadays, when people trying to understand or have a glimpse of their base, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. They're misidentifying the chemical change and the state of consciousness they're having with the base. It's not that. It's completely different than that. Though the drug can help point you to the base, the drug cannot create the experience of the base. And I think that's truly important to understand. Okay, it can point you to the base. It cannot create the experience of the base, nor your understanding, comprehension of it, and imbibing of it so that you identify with it as yourself, and you can then continue to practice at this deeper level. So we have this inherent problem, as sadhaks, with working with drugs and plant medicines to open. And that's a problem. Okay. The other big problem is that this was something that was taken in from the outside. So it's a crutch, it's an aid. Like I said earlier, though, a necessary aid for those who need it, maybe, as a one-off, in the right context. But over and over and over again, it just debilitates the person's confidence in their ability to achieve that on their own, actually. And that's why you see people wanting to do the sessions more closer together on a calendar, because they want to continue to feel that kind of high in between, that kind of experience, identifying with the concept of the base instead of the base. And this is really problematic for yogins, and it will create a problem in the after-death states, right? Which is not good at all. So we want the Shaktipata experience to be met by our own experience of the base, cultivated through meditation, cultivated through view training, cultivated through continually touching the base with Shaktipatas, going from, a 1 level, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, eventually full realization, rainbow-like body, right? And this is maybe the most important point, is that for us yogins, we want to be able to learn to do what the drug does for us, but it's under our own conscious control. And that means that we don't have anything that has changed our brain chemistry forcibly for a certain set period of time that we cannot change. Of course, great masters who are very high level, and even myself to some degree, are able to not be affected in our consciousness state by chemicals, because we've actually trained on that, right? It's quite funny that most people think about, I want to get high with drugs, and what we do in Trikamasa Yoga and Tantric Yoga, how I trained was, I want to get sober on drugs. And that's really the total difference in the training. Is all I did was become sober, to the point where I could take the strongest drugs and become totally lucid and sober and not slur my words and be silly, or, and have complete meditative ability. So it's kind of a completely different type of outcome and goal, isn't it? To have that conscious control. And we really need that conscious control if we're going to approach this as a yogin. That's a really important thing. So with that conscious control, there's another factor I think that's kind of missing in today's experience of the drug thing as it comes over, the drug experience as we drag it into spiritual work of the modern yogin especially, is the most important point of confidence. You see, when I had Shaktipatas, granted I had very strong ones, high up the stages, like stage 6, 7 kind of Shaktipatas out of 9 when I was quite young. And that drove me down this path of seeking spirituality from the time I was 7, really strongly. But I had a Shaktipata around 7 that was, mild. Maybe it was like 1 or 2 or 3. But I had very profound and strong ones, 6 or 7 when I was 12. And that really put me in it. And then every 5 or 6 years after, I was having another one. They weren't given by my teacher. They were spontaneous, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing. Each one of those Shaktipata experiences did one powerful thing: increased my confidence, powerfully increased my confidence in what the base is, that's who I am, and that I'm moving towards an expression of being one with that experience in an unbroken fashion as I go deeper into my spiritual practices. I don't think that confidence is derived from a drug experience. In fact, I'm pretty sure it isn't. And most people that do drugs then don't continue to go very deep into sadhana because they're missing the other important part of the picture. Shaktipata was never meant to be the be-all and end-all spiritual work. There's so much talk about awakenings. You can sell any workshop if you put the word awakening in it now. It's ridiculous. But people don't know what they're talking about, honestly. Because awakenings are important but brief. And then what do you do in between? That's called spiritual practice, and that's called sadhana, spiritual practice, right? There's an old saying in the oral tradition, this oral practice tradition we come from. You receive the Shaktipata, then you supplement the Shaktipata with sadhana. You supplement it and supplement it and supplement it until you bring yourself to a new ripe level where the universe can't help but reveal the next level to you. Boom, the next Shaktipata, okay? But because we're always looking at that next level awakening as the big thing, boom, the Shaktipata, we often forget that 99.9% of the time is spent in the sadhana, preparing for that moment, which is spontaneous, which is chaotic, which is completely out of our control. Shaktipata is completely out of our control. Even when you take a drug, it's out of your control. Many, many people do DMT, don't get Shaktipata. Many people take peyote, don't get Shaktipata, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about training, and it goes back to conditioning the mind and the mind channels and the chakras and the bindus, all these different aspects, the pranas even, and the senses and the sense gates and the 5 elements and the goddesses of the 5 elements and so on, conditioning all that mechanism to recognize the base when the base is prevalent. Because otherwise we have conceptual karmic impressions in the senses, sense gates, those dakinis are not awakened, in our prana channels, 45 pranas, in obscuring the 5 elements, in the chakra, etc. So we have all kinds of energy being released when we take a drug in those esoteric anatomy I just described. However, here's an extremely salient point. The energy being released in those anatomy I just described when we take the drugs are not the base. They're not the base. They're just other types of energy. And that doesn't get you enlightened. So we get Shaktipatas, we supplement with sadhana. We get another Shaktipata, we keep supplementing with sadhana, and the game isn't over until we're realized, stage 10, 11, or 12, basically. So the trick is not to get more and more Shaktipata. The trick is not to take more and more drugs. And this extends into spiritual practice, where the trick is, it's not to go to more and more empowerments with the Lama who's in town this week, or to go to more and more sessions of sitting with meditation with your guru to get more Shaktipata. No, those things can create rarefied psychosocial spiritual environments which get you past your own limitations and help you open. And that's the beauty of those choreographed, orchestrated environments, right? Group practice with your teacher, or a special initiation ceremony that's led up to with a lot of pomp and circumstance and practice as a preliminary, and you get there and you sit there and like, boom, this thing hits. It's not really because they waved the magic wand. It's the preparation that you've been doing in your mind experience, and also that the teacher is skilled in this type of transmission. They're not transmitting the base though. They're transmitting the knowledge of how to open for you to open into the base. They're transmitting the environment for that. And I know that goes against a lot of sacred cows lately, because gurus love to make commercial ventures out of becoming the one who has the energy to awaken you. I've got the energy to awaken you. Come to my retreat and I will give you Shaktipata every day. Or, as the big cult leaders do, say, look, you need to do nothing. As Dafri John, the biggest cult leader of all time, you need to do nothing, he said, but come and sit at my knee. And I will give you the Shaktipata and show you that you are God, and you need to do nothing but just surrender to me. Man, that is such cult language. Run for the hills. I don't care who the Lama or Guru is who says it to you. Run for the hills. Crazy talk. Just crazy talk, okay? So hopefully we better understand the role of plants, drugs, etc. in awakening. We better understand the role of awakening in our spiritual life and how it has to be supplemented with sadhana, because until we stabilize that experience of the base, we're not realized. We must accept that about ourselves. And if mentors were honest, they would say, yeah, I might have experience of the base for 4 or 5 seconds during a meditation every day. And that's what even Namkhai Norbu said, that. A man who's giving Dzogchen transmission all the time before he died recently. So if he was saying he's only getting it, for 4 or 5 seconds in a 2-hour meditation, when we asked him that, then you can be pretty sure that people who are taking the drugs are not walking around in the experience of the base. It is a major misunderstanding of the teaching of non-duality to say, oh, I am already the non-dual, and I glimpsed it during a mushroom trip, and now I'm walking around in the base. It's simply not true. And it's also a major delusion that people are grabbing onto, which is putting them into the God realm. And the God realm is almost impossible to get out of, because you believe that what you're saying is true and that everybody else is an inferior being and doesn't understand how amazing you are, and how amazing you are now that you got this Al-Shadi from plant medicine. These are very dangerous pitfalls of the path for people when they use drugs. So as I first came out and said, yes, it's very useful in the right context, socially, a social community context with spiritual seekers, once a year, whatever. For those people that don't have the highest aptitude, it really can be helpful. It can be helpful for a breakthrough for a person individually. But again, it's all about breakthrough, and it's all about understanding, learning to recognize your true nature, the base, identify with it, confirm it for yourself, and have that confidence, and then stabilize and consistently stay in that state. That's the whole path. And like I said, the confidence factor is very difficult to get from the drug side of it, maybe even impossible. And that's why you see people running around for more and more. And to summarize, that extends into people running to more gurus and more lamas. People just keep going to more and more different gurus, more and more different lamas all the time. Oh, I have this teacher, but I'm going to get it from so many more that I'm going to get juiced up, filled up with all this Shaktipata, as if it was a thing, Shaktipata. You can fill up on it, and it's going to spill over, and you're going to become one with everything. This is a misunderstanding, okay? So thanks for joining today. Sorry we had a break in the transmission. We do live in the jungle here in Costa Rica. It will happen from time to time. When it does happen and the video ends, just go back and look for me to come online again as soon as our power comes back or as soon as the cable is restored on the internet, whatever it is, okay? All the best, and I hope this was helpful. Give some feedback on the comments section, and maybe it can make for another video later, okay? All the best. Sarva Mangala.